Welcome back. I'm here today with Gary Rogers, and Gary's been a longtime resident of the Bay Area and also has done many successful ventures, probably most noted for Dreyer's ice cream. And Gary, welcome to today's show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So Gary, for the listeners, can you give your background and things that you've done to bring you up to today?
Okay. Well, I was born in California, grew up here, grew up in Marin County before it was Marin County. It was a very rural, agricultural dairy area when I was growing up there. And, went to public schools, wound up at the University of California as an engineering student, graduated there after a lot of different activities, wound up doing 2 years in the Army. In those days, we all had to do ROTC, and you had a choice of either being drafted or getting your commission if you took 4 years of ROTC. So I did the latter, found that to be a really good experience. Went on to the Harvard Business School, which was really a right turn for me. I certainly hadn't expected it, but that too was just an amazing experience. I was scared stiff. I'll tell a quick little story here. A friend of mine had me as an usher in his wedding, and his usher gifts, he had given me a Silver Cross pen, which I thought was a really cool deal. So when I went to Harvard Business School, of course, we all wear coats and ties, and I had my Silver Cross pen, and I was ready to take notes. Well, my first class, I looked to the right, gold. I looked to the left, gold. I looked up behind me in this amphitheater classroom, gold. And I went home and I told my wife, honey, we just aren't going to make it here. This is too much. But I survived. I actually wound up what they call a Baker Scholar in the top 5% of my class, and went on to McKinsey Co, which was kind of the place everybody wanted to work in those days, and I think still is a great place for business school graduates. And then wound up founding a restaurant company of all things. And the short story there is we opened 5 restaurants and went broke. I think that's something every successful businessman ought to do. I really had to pick myself up off the ground with, no money. I had 4 kids at home, all under the age of 7. I really didn't want to go back to work for anybody else because I'd had the joy of having my own company, even though we'd failed. And I wound up buying Dreyer's ice cream with $1 million of other people's money. And we built Dreyer's into the largest ice cream company in the United States, sold it to Nestle for $3.2 billion. And that was 10 years ago, or actually 12 years ago, because I stayed on for 2 years and ran Dreyer's for Nestle after they owned it. And then since then, I've done a wide variety of things. I've sat on many, many boards. I was chairman of Levi Strauss for a number of years. I was chairman of Safeway for a number of years. I was chairman of the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank for 2 years. I was on the board for 6. But interestingly, I was there in the financial crisis. So Janet Yellen was my president. I can say that the most powerful person in the world, who I think the Fed chairman is, I think the most powerful person in the world worked for me. It's kind of fun. I'm still, I think I'm on 6 boards currently, 3 for-profit boards and 3 more philanthropic boards. And I'm very involved in the Oakland community and have a wonderful family of 4 boys and 11 grandchildren, and life is good. I'm about to be 75, and I can smile at sort of, what's happened as I've gone down the trail, and I'm still very much enjoying life.
It's an amazing life, and, I just note here, after all these great accomplishments, you christened all this with your family and your grandkids, and I think that gives us perspective in life, doesn't it?
The older you get, the more you realize that's really what it's all about. Yeah.
Well, Gary, I want to roll back and spend a little bit of time going through your Dreyer's experience. Most people go to the grocery store and they see that brand every week, and it's still a very prominent brand. However, I'm running up against the break right now.
Okay.
And so I'm visiting here today with Gary Rogers. He's a longtime entrepreneur, resident of the San Francisco Bay Area, philanthropist. And after we come back from the break, we'll talk about Dreyer's.
Great.
We'll be right back after these messages.
Okay.
But you can't take your wealth with you. Spend time with your family. Welcome back. I'm visiting here today with Gary Rogers, and Gary has been a longtime entrepreneur, philanthropist, and resident of the Bay Area community. And Gary, in the first segment, we talked about you had ventures before, but one of the most notable ventures that you did was that of purchasing Dreyer's ice cream in 1976.
Right.
Company was founded in 1928.
Right.
So what did you do different? It was a relatively small regional company at the time, but how did you take that from what it was to what it became?
Well, I think my answer is mostly about people, but we also did some things right strategically. When I bought the company, the owner at that time took me out behind the plant, and he showed me 7 or 8 beat-up 20-year-old ice cream trucks. And, of course, my instincts as a Harvard Business School grad and McKinsey consultant, all that was, well, we'll sell the trucks. And I knew that all the big grocers operated ice cream warehouses, and almost all the ice creams were sold through the warehouse, and the chain themselves would handle the distribution and the stocking of the stores. And that was my first idea to get this company on track. But this owner said to me, it's very simple. He said, Gary, whatever you do, don't sell the trucks. And I'd just gone broke in the restaurant business. And so I thought maybe it wouldn't be smart to take the primary advice that the former owner had given me and just ignore it right out of the blocks. So we started off with what they called direct store delivery. And that became probably our key strategic element. And what we found was that there were a lot of reasons why handling the ice cream yourself right to the cabinet. Just briefly, these grocery employees are always overworked. The ice cream tends to sit in the aisle when they're stocking it at 2 a.m. Ours was a premium ice cream. You know what happens to ice cream if it melts before it gets back into the freezer. And then by having a relationship with the store-level people, our salesmen could gradually get more space. They could say, well, Haagen-Dazs didn't fill their cabinet, their shelf today. Let us fill it for you. Or, there's a little space down here that really isn't used properly. And at store level, you could do a tremendous amount of selling. In the previous company, they had called it ice cream drivers. We called them ice cream salesmen. And just that little change made a huge difference. And we turned out to be the most overstocked ice cream. We had more shelf space relative to our sales than anybody else in the industry. And that proved to be a really key element of our strategy. It also facilitates something called scan-based trading, where instead of having the store clerk come out when we showed up with our truck and count the ice cream as we brought it into the store and handle an invoice and all that sort of thing, we were able to have the grocer incur his obligation to us. The ice cream would be put in the store on a basis where it was still our ice cream. It wasn't the store's ice cream. It was on consignment. And when the ice cream went over the scanner, the grocer incurred the obligation to us at the same time that he took money from his customer. And they really liked that. And they would pay us the following Monday for all the ice cream that had gone over their scanner the preceding week. Well, what that did, in addition to being a much more efficient way of handling the ice cream and the transaction through the store, it gave us the knowledge of what the store had sold. We always knew what it had bought from us, but now by knowing what it had sold, we knew by definition exactly what the inventory was in the store at all times, day by day. And so we could route our trucks the way UPS does. I mean, if a store didn't need service, we'd just pass it by. And that made us much more efficient. But the really different thing we did is we developed a culture that was probably the biggest element in our success. And we were very careful who we hired. If you came to work for us, you'd probably go through 6 or 7 really intensive interviews. And it was very hard to get on board. But once you were an employee, you were trusted. If you came to work for us, we would give you a business card with your name on the front and whatever your title was. You turn it over, it would say company philosophy. Use your own best judgment at all times. And we practiced that. We had something we called the upside down organization, which meant that as CEO, I was at the bottom of where the pyramid was sharp and it was digging into the ground. And that we had this philosophy that the people that really made for the success of the company were the people who made the ice cream, the people who delivered the ice cream, the people who sold the ice cream. And we tried to sort of invert the way the whole organization worked so that the people who did the real work got the credit. And that had a transformative impact on the company. We also trusted our people beyond any company I've seen. I mean, we felt that the person who was on the front line, the person who had the responsibility for a issue, probably had a better perspective on it than anybody else in the company. So if you work for me and you came to me with a suggestion, I would hear you out. I would give you my honest opinion of what I thought the pros and cons were. But at the end of that conversation, I would say, Alan, you decide. Now, that seems like a fairly simple thing. But, having worked in companies, I know that the subordinate always expects the superior to make the decision at the end of a conversation like that. And if you think about that, if you're a good employee, you're a good soldier, you go off and you try to make that decision effective. But if it doesn't work, and you say to yourself, well, Gary made the decision, I didn't. But if I say to you, you decide, it takes that all away. And now you're responsible for the decision. You're also responsible for the outcome. And so I've come to believe that you decide are the two most powerful words in the English language. My wife, my kids are so tired of having me say, you decide when there's a family decision to be made. But it is amazingly effective. So that's just one example. I mean, I give you a lot of other examples of the kind of things we did. But our people were so loyal and so committed, and they knew they were trusted. And it was okay to fail. We encouraged failure. And it was terribly powerful for us.
I'm visiting here today with Gary Rogers, and Gary is most noted for his role at Dreyer's Ice Cream. But Gary, you've done a lot of other things, but I'm running up against the break.
Yeah.
So after we get back, I want to talk about your exit from Dreyer's, or your sale to Nestle's, and then what you've done post Dreyer's.
Okay.
We'll be right back after these messages.
I love fishing, with my family.
I think it would be easier to use a net.
It was so much fun.
The times when we are together, it makes it all the more worth it.
Having Dad teach them how to cast a fly rod, and
as long as we're doing stuff together, we're having fun.
Some people see a father and a son fishing together, while others see a succession plan.
Welcome back. I'm visiting here today with Gary Rogers. And Gary, we're talking about your role at Dreyer's, acquiring the company with a partner in 1976, building it into a name brand in the store, and then eventually selling out in 2001. I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about what led up to the exit. And then post Dreyer's, what did you go on to do?
Well, the story of Nestle and Dreyer's was a long one, because we had just barely acquired Dreyer's when the president of Nestle USA, the USA division of this huge, at that time, $60 billion food company, gave me a call, and he wanted to come see me. And from that day forward, almost every month, until we finally sold him a piece of the company, he was there. See, Nestle and Unilever were worldwide competitors in ice cream. If you added up all their ice cream businesses around the world, Unilever had just a slight lead on Nestle. And the acquisition of Dreyer's, even when it was small, by Nestle would have put them in first place. So that's the way these big companies work, all right? And they really were eager to acquire Dreyer's, and they made it clear they were very fair. They never were really tough. I mean, they just kept making the argument over and over and over again. And when the CEO of Nestle calls, you've got to answer, all right? So finally, after I don't know how many years, we agreed to sell Nestle 18% of Dreyer's. It was part of my defensive strategy, because by selling them 18%, they agreed to a 10-year standstill. So that meant that for 10 years, this pressure that I'd been under to sell the rest of the company would go away. And it did. They honored that 10-year contract. And I thought 10 years was a long, long time. I mean, for Nestle, who thinks in centuries, 10 years was just for them, it was a stakehold position. For me, it was a defensive decision, all right? But that 10 years went by very quickly. When the 9-year point came by, the CEO of Nestle started to land on my couch again, and we wound up agreeing to an extraordinarily attractive offer for my shareholders. And, when you're a public company, you've got to think in terms of what's in the best interest of the shareholders. And so this company that we had acquired for $1 million 25 years before, we were able to sell for $3.2 billion. And the IRR was something like 42% for 25 years. So it was an extraordinarily successful financial transaction. But it also achieved Nestle's goal of being the largest ice cream company in the world.
So after this exit, you found some time to do other things. And what did you go on?
Well, it took, actually, the transaction, for complicated reasons, it was 3 years before it closed. It was agreed to. It wasn't subject to performance, but so there was 3 years until it closed, and then we had some complications with the Fair Trade Commission in terms of deeming us a monopolist in certain respects. So we had to work through that. So it was really 4 years before we got the transaction closed. And then Nestle asked me to keep running the company, which I had thought about, and I said, no, there's no way you would agree to my conditions. And he said, this is the CEO of Nestle. He said, well, what are they? And I told him what they were. And he said, well, of course we can't agree to that. And I said, I told you. He called me a week later and he said, we'll do it. So for 2 years, I ran the company. But by then it was 2007 or 2008. It was time to move on. So I did. And I've done a wide variety of things since then. I was the first non-family chairman of Levi Strauss. The chairman of Levi Strauss, when I was in college, was Walter Haas Sr. And he wrote me a letter that I know had a big influence on getting me into the Harvard Business School. Well, as life would have it, serendipity is amazing. I found myself sitting in his chair at his desk with his title as chairman of Levi Strauss. Who would have thought, But then I went on, and for other complicated reasons, I was on the Safeway board, and they elevated me to chairman at a time of transition. And I was there as we sold Safeway for $10.7 billion to a combination of Cerebus and Albertsons. That was quite a story in and of itself. And I was chairman of the San Francisco Fed, which was an amazing experience because Janet Yellen was my president when I was chairman. And there I was working with the former chairman of the Big Fed, as they call it, back in Washington. And that was just an incredible experience. And then I've had wonderful experiences with these board positions, one of which, for example, is Stanislaus Food Products, which is a tomato processor and now an olive processor out in Stockton, California. And I've been on that board for 28 years, and it's just been a joy. It's just so much fun. I've got a great relationship with the other people on the board and with the CEO there, and working through the problems of that medium-sized company has been fascinating. I'm also on the board of Shorenstein Realty, which takes me into a whole different world of very sophisticated, very large, largely office building transactions from that very successful real estate fund company. And I can go on, but I just seem to, I don't get stressed. I'm always got more to do than I can do. And I believe that the joy of life is in the doing. It's in the journey. It's in the struggle. And I'm just very pleased with the way life has worked out for me.
Now, Gary, you've done a lot of different things, but how do you find balance in life as you're going through the journey?
I haven't found it that difficult. I think people stress, how difficult it is. I mean, I've got a huge family. 11 grandchildren. I've got 4 boys. They're all married. They're all happy. They're all doing good things. And all this business activity that I've begun to describe here. But in addition to that, I counted up the number of pins in my map the other day. And outside of the United States, where I've basically been everywhere with my dryers, we had a sales office in every city in the country. I have 280 pins in my map, which means 280 separate cities. Okay, I've been to the North Pole. I don't mean the Arctic. I mean the North Pole. I've been to the South Pole. I don't mean the Antarctic. I mean the South Pole. When I did that, there were only 50 people who had been to both the North and South Pole. All right. I've been to every single Aman hotel. I'm just a junkie for that hotel chain, Aman Resorts, and they have 30 hotels now. I've been to every single one of them, all over the world. So, I mean, my wife and I have been able to find a balance. We have a wonderful family. Everybody gets along. We've got wonderful daughters-in-law. We have 11 grandchildren. Somehow it's just worked out.
Gary, I'm running up against the break, but I'd like to hold you over for one more segment if I could. Visiting here today with Gary Rogers, and we'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back. I'm visiting here today with Gary Rogers. And Gary, it's been an amazing show listening to all the stories and what you've been able to do over your life. And I understand you even wrote a book called The Spirit of Adventure.
Yeah, right, true.
So knowing what you know today and having this wealth of experience and successes and experiencing failures along the way, what message would you give to the up-and-coming generation today?
I think the first thing I'd say is don't overplan. I have a theory that if you get the days right, then the weeks will be right. If you get the weeks right, the months will be right. If you get the months right, the years will be right, and so forth. So I take a hot tub every night for only like 10 minutes, and I think of only 2 things in that hot tub. Number one, how did the day go? What did I do? Tonight I'll be thinking about this interview that we've just done. And then I think about tomorrow. What's on for tomorrow? Who am I going to meet? What do I want to cover? And it isn't being self-critical. It's just being thoughtful and prepared. And my goal is my theory is you only get one trip around this track of life. There are no mulligans. I mean, we are never going to do this interview again. Let's make it as good as it can be. And who are you going to have lunch with tomorrow? And what can you learn from that person? And I mean, that kind of attitude. And that also stems from a belief that life is really about serendipity. It's very hard to plan. Lots of times you young people have a 5-year plan or whatever. Those plans almost never work out. There's too much just randomness and serendipity in life. But what one has to do, the Boy Scouts have a motto. It's be prepared. And Louis Pasteur said it a little more elegantly. He said, fortune favors only the prepared mind. And so what I find is really important is to be able to cope with opportunity that comes your way. We all see much more opportunity than you think we see. And some people are prepared through schooling or experience or just instinct to turn those opportunities into things that are of value to them, and others aren't. And, when I look back at my life, most of the, quote, successes I've had, I didn't think about, I didn't plan. They just kind of happened. But I was able to deal with the opportunity when it came along. I mean, Dreyer's Grand Ice Cream, for example, when I met, I went into the Dreyer's office to talk to them about whether they had a franchise program for ice cream dip shops. And I happened to be introduced to the then owner and CEO of Dreyer's. And he just happened to be finishing a phone call that was, I could tell, very important. And he hung up the phone. He had tears in his eyes. And I offered to excuse myself. And he said, no, let me tell you what just happened. He said, that was my bank. They turned me down for a loan. I desperately need to keep this company going. So what do you say to someone like that? I've just come off of an experience. I'm broke. What do you say to somebody like that? Well, I knew enough to say, have you ever considered selling the company? Most people wouldn't do that. they'd offer to get him another bank or to help him find some equity or whatever. But I just blurted out the words that changed my life. Have you ever considered selling the company? And he said, no, not till just now. 2 days later, I had an option to buy his company for $1 million. And he asked me, he said, how are you going to pay me? I said, I'll give you a check. I didn't lie to him. I didn't tell him it wouldn't be my check. And I did give him a check for $1 million. So, that's a good example of, I think, the attitude that one should take. And then follow your passions. You should never spend a day of this life bored or doing something that you find distasteful or that you really don't want to do or that doesn't lead to something worthwhile for you. I'm not saying that every day, every week of your life is going to be fantastic, but I've learned that every decade of my life has been better than the preceding ones. When I was a teenager, I thought, how could life be better than this? Driving around on my hot rod with my girlfriends. I'm now in my 70s. I've never had so much fun, okay? So that's a short version of my philosophy.
I love it. Very, very inspiring, and also helping to give perspective of take the risk, enjoy the journey.
That's right. Enjoy the journey. Go for the gusto.
Been visiting here today with Gary Rogers, and thanks for being with us today, Gary.
It's been my pleasure. It's been lots of fun.